Hello, National 5 history. So this week we are looking at what was it like for Scots fighting on the Western Front. So last week you looked at recruitment and propaganda, so why Scottish soldiers actually joined up to fight in the war. This week we're going to look at what it was like for them actually fighting in the war. So our learning intentions by the end of this lesson, what you're aiming to be able to do is firstly to understand how trench warfare developed during the First World War, so how did we end up with trenches, and to draw and label the design of the trenches on the Western Front. So this will be our first part of trenches in the Western Front this week. Your second part, which we'll also look at this week, is conditions in the trenches in a bit more detail. But this is what we're looking at today. So how did trenches actually appear on the Western Front, and what was the typical design of a trench? Now, just a quick overview. The most important feature of fighting on the Western Front and the World War I was the trench system. Now, this ran from the North Sea coast of Belgium right down to the Swiss frontier, so it was a long, long way. When war broke out, there were actually no trenches in no Western Front. So, the question is, how did it get there? How did we end up with trenches in the Western Front? Now, there was a few significant battles which led to trench warfare. So we start at the top left here, which is the Sleven Plan in Mons. Now, the Germans had a plan to win a war on two fronts, and that plan was basically called the Sleven Plan. And the whole point in the Sleven Plan was to get a quick victory over France. They reckoned that they could defeat France in 42 days, so just over a month, using the Sleven Plan. After defeating France, the plan was then that the German troops would then move across Europe and deal with the Russians in the east. So defeat France in the west and then Russia in the east. But the Germans had underestimated the strength of the Belgian and British armies, who held firm at the Battle of Mons. Now, the Battle of Mons was actually a turning point in the war, in the sense that it was the start of the Sleven Plan failing. That then led us on to the Battle of Marne. Now, at the Battle of Marne, the Germans prepared to attack the French army near the River Marne, but the British Expeditionary Force and French armies joined together at Marne and prepared for the onslaught. Now, although the German attack was ferocious, the Germans made a crucial mistake, which led to their armies being cut off from each other, and that then meant that they had to retreat to the River Asne. Now, this smashed the Sleven Plan completely, and this stopped the Germans from the necessary goal of defeating France quickly. So after the Sleven Plan in Mons had failed ultimately for the Germans, and the Battle of Marne had forced them back even further, this meant that the Germans weren't going to succeed in their goal of defeating France as quickly as what they had hoped. Then we have the retreat to Aisne. Now, the British and French pursued the retreating German armies here to Aisne, but they weren't quick enough. And when the Germans got to River Aisne, they dug in. And by digging in, that helped them to hold their gains that they had gained so far. Now, the British and French did try to flank the Germans, but the German armies responded with the same move, and this ultimately began the race to the sea and the beginning of trench warfare. Now, the last significant battle and part of this is the race to the sea. So both sides tried to get to the English Channel in order to secure the important seaports in Belgium and northern France. When they reached the Channel ports, the Germans dug trenches in order to hold their positions, and by 18th October 1914, the race to the sea had finished and both sides were entrenched. So ultimately they dug themselves in. So there have been these battles here. Had the Sleven Plan been successful, that's what starts it all. Had the Sleven Plan been successful for the Germans, they would have defeated the French, and we might never have saw anything such as trenches on the Western Front. However, because the Sleven Plan fails and significant battles push the Germans back, ultimately both sides, the Allies, so the French and British, and the Belgians, end up digging themselves in, and ultimately they're fighting against the Germans, who have dug themselves in as well. So we now have what's known as a stalemate. Ultimately, neither side is really able to win here. They've dug themselves into trenches. Now, that, as I said, leads to the Western Front. This first picture here just shows you, ultimately, the system of trenches running right down from the Channel right through. Now, a new border between Germany and France had effectively been created due to this Western Front. Now, most of Belgium was now under German control, because remember, they had tried to go through Belgium to invade France. And this border became known as the Western Front. The reason it's called the Western Front, it's in the west of Europe, obviously, and the front as in the front line, so the Western Front it became known as. Now, it would actually hardly change during the next 4 murderous years of the war, so neither side really made massive gains, due to a number of reasons, one of the main ones being new technology that was introduced, with both sides having the capability to kill a lot of soldiers, but we'll be looking at that in more detail in a few weeks' time. So, why was World War I fought in trenches? Ultimately, both sides dug themselves in to protect themselves. Now, at first, these were just simple ditches, but it soon became clear that the soldiers were going to be in the trenches for some time. And once in the trenches, they would be able to keep each other pinned down with machine gun fire. So it was very, very hard to make any sort of gain from either side. Now, task 1. On your task sheet that you have to upload to your via the assignment tab, your first task is to answer a question about this keyword. So what is a stalemate? Now, a stalemate, to help you to answer this, a stalemate is an unresolved situation which no one can win. So ultimately, as I mentioned, World War One was becoming a stalemate here. Neither side was able to win, and they were stuck in their trenches, not able to make any gains. Now, what I'd like you to do next is to pause the PowerPoint at this point and to watch a clip from Dan Snow, which is Why Trenches. Now, this is a really, really good clip. It only lasts about 7 minutes, but this just explains in more detail why trenches were built in the war, the reason for doing it. The link for this is in the instructions that were posted at the start of the week on your team. So if you pause at this point and just watch that video, and that will help you in more detail to explain why trenches were built in World War One. Okay, so just to stop and check, our first aim today was to understand how trench warfare developed during the First World War. So ultimately, because the Germans failed to invade France through the Sleeving Plan, and a number of battles pushed the Germans back, it means that both sides dig themselves in to ultimately protect themselves. So make sure that you're happy with that first part of how trench warfare developed during the First World War. If you have any questions, you can note them down and ask. Okay, so now just a few pictures to show you ultimately the Western Front that's been created. Now, the trenches became home for millions of soldiers on both sides. Now, the Western Front stretched nearly 500 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland, and the fighting front for Germany and Russia was known as the Eastern Front, so that's obviously in the east. Now, during the 4 years the war lasted on the Western Front, the front lines of the two sides moved only about 30 kilometres, which is only about 18 miles one way or the other. So as I said, there wasn't massive gains made by either side. It wasn't until 1918 that the stalemate started to break. Now, this is just an image here showing you some of the trenches that obviously existed. You've got it colour coded there, but you have French, Belgian, British trenches all around down one side, and then you have obviously German trenches down the other as well. But you see how it starts up at the top, up at the north, right down to Switzerland. Now, the German trenches were actually built to defend the territory they had occupied. Now, these were on higher ridges which overlooked the surrounding countryside. Now, the Germans did something which not a lot of people expect them to do, but proved to be quite successful in some respects, is that they used coal miners who were used to digging passageways to dig their trenches. Now, they had deep dugouts where men could rest and unwind, and were often reinforced with concrete, so the German trenches were notorious for being very, very well built. The Allied trenches were slightly different. The British and French had to build their trenches on the lower ground. Now, this land was liable to flooding, and their generals believed that ultimately the men should always be pushing forward to get the Germans out of France and Belgium. They should always be on the offensive. So their trenches weren't as well built or fortified compared to the German trenches. Now, how were trenches actually designed? Now, trenches were designed to give the men in them as much protection as possible. Now, they were usually dug deep enough for a soldier to walk along safely and not be seen by the enemy, and they were dug in a zigzag pattern. The reason for that, when we look at weapons, we'll find out about artillery. Had an artillery shell hit a trench that was in a straight line, it would have caused huge amounts of damage, and a lot of men would be killed. By digging the trench in zigzags, that meant if the trench was bombed, then the impact could be limited to a certain area. The trench usually had the soil dug out of the trench piled up in front of it to offer more protection, and it had a firing step, which we'll look at as well, to allow the men to defend their position. Now, task 2, how were trenches designed? What I'd like you to do is to use the next few slides to complete your table on features of the trenches. So again, if you make sure you've got that handy as a copy, and you can be filling it out as we go over some of the key features of a trench. So the first one was the latrine, or the toilet. And this type of toilet would not flush, obviously, and was often very, very smelly, so a hole in the ground effectively for soldiers in the trench to do the toilet. Another key feature was the machine gun. Now, the machine gun, which is how we'll look at in more detail when it comes to technology and weapons that were used, but this was manned by two men, the gunner and the spotter. Now, the spotter's job was to tell the gunner where to shoot, and hundreds of men could be killed within minutes because machine guns were capable of firing at least 400 bullets a minute. There was also a fire step, which you see a picture of there. Now, this was stood on by the machine gunners to give them obviously more height and a better view as they fired onto oncoming enemy soldiers. So that gives you an idea of why it was so difficult to gain ground as well. If you go out to what is known as no man's land to attack the enemy trench, then you're facing machine gun fire. It's not going to be really a good chance of making a lot of ground up due to the fact that you're facing bullets. There was a periscope. Now this was a special type of telescope that allowed soldiers to see over the trench without being shot, so they could actually look in the bottom there, and there was reflective glass that then let them see over the top of the trench, so they didn't need to sit their head up to have a look. Sandbags. Now these sacks were filled with sand, obviously, and the reason for that was to protect soldiers from bullets and explosions. So it was hoped that having sandbags reinforced in front of your trench could protect you from bullets. Railway sleepers were also used. Now these were thick blocks of wood which were basically used to make the back wall of a trench stronger in the rain, because the wood got very, very wet, then it could end up rotting and the trench collapsing, but the railway sleepers were used to try and make sure that never happened. Duckboards were also used. Now duckboards were wooden slats that soldiers could walk across, and it would keep their feet out of the mud and the water. However, the ultimate reality was that men often stood knee deep in water for hours or days, and that leads to horrendous diseases like trench foot. Okay, so that was task number 2 there. Now task number 3 is an imagination doodle. Now what I'd like you to do is, now that you know a bit more about what trenches contained, the sort of features that they had, try and draw what you think the typical trench would look like, and label it with everything you have on your list in your trench. I want you to pause the video while you're doing this, and then we're going to look at what some of the typical trenches look like. So, what did a typical trench look like? In theory, this is what your typical trench would look like. So, on the left hand side of the picture here, you'll see it says to the enemy trenches across no man's land. So, the land in between both trenches was known as no man's land. You had barbed wire in front of your trench to protect yourself, and you also had sandbags. Now the barbed wire was obviously there if attacking soldiers run towards your trench to slow them down, and you had sandbags there to protect you from bullets and explosions. You'll then see that the trench is dug about 6 feet deep and about 5 feet wide. You've got an ammunition ledge there where you keep obviously your bullets. You've got a fire step to step up on to give yourself a better view. You've got duck boards to obviously walk on to keep your feet dry. You'll see you've got a wooden prop at the door when you can go slightly underground, where you've got a place that you could sleep or go and speak to people. You've got a sandbag behind you as well, and more barbed wire as well. So this is the typical side view of a trench. You also see there a rat labelled. We'll look at that in more detail when we'll look at conditions in the trench, but rats were a horrendous problem for soldiers as well. Now this is a picture of French soldiers in the trench. If you look at the depth of it and think about that, and think about picking out where's the barbed wire, well, you could see that there. The parapet, you see that there, and the fire step, which the French soldiers are standing on. Now, have the walls been strengthened here? You'll see that obviously there's been mud piled up, and there's also sandbags as well. Now what's missing is duckboards. Now, it says here to suggest the reason why there are no duckboards. Think about why there might not be duckboards in this trench. And here's another image here of soldiers in the trenches. You'll see there again, this is a soldier using a periscope, and you've got the sandbags there to protect themselves as well. This is another picture here of soldiers in the trenches. You'll see obviously surrounding them how horrendous the conditions are. These soldiers are wearing gas masks to protect themselves from a gas attack. Now, because these men were only meant to be in the temporary trenches and not always dug out as well as they could be, that caused a lot of problems. And one major issue for the British was drainage. Now the constant shelling, so the constant bombing of the trenches, meant that the natural drainage of the lowland and the heavy rains of the northern France led to muddy and often flooded trenches. Now, as the war continued, the networks of trenches became more sophisticated, and they soon brought in reserve trenches, communication trenches. Even some trenches had their own railway system, they had their own hospitals, their own kitchens, and even defensive strong points. So the trenches actually started to develop when they realised that they were going to be in them for a long, long time. So you might end up with a situation like this here. You'll see you've got the frontline trench, and in between the frontline trench and the German trench, obviously no man's land. You've then got a support trench where soldiers would be based to obviously support the frontline trench. You've got a regiment aid post further back to treat wounded soldiers. You've got a reserve trench, and you also have the artillery post there as well. You can see where shells would be fired onto the enemy. You also have a communication trench which is built in there as well. So the trench system very, very sophisticated ultimately. You obviously see as well that again it's not in a straight line, it's zigzagged to make sure that if a bomb does hit, then the damage is contained to that one area. This is another image here of what a typical trench may look like. Again, you'll see no man's land on the left hand side there, and you'll see the zigzag formation that they've got there of the trench. Obviously, further back to the reserve trench, you've even got some company headquarters there which are dug out. More than likely that would be more than a German trench, but British trenches did have that as well. Now, this image here just shows you ultimately a bit more about the trenches from an aerial view. So that is your frontline trench there in the orange. You then have a support trench in blue, so that would be soldiers based there to replace the soldiers on the front line, because you wouldn't be expected to stay at the front line for the whole of the war, obviously, or even more than a couple of days. You would be replaced constantly to make sure that the soldiers fresh, if that's possible. However, that wasn't always possible, and you might need to spend a long time right on the front line. You then have a reserve trench as well, and you've got a communication trench, which allows you to communicate. You'll see there the way that trench is running with all the other trenches. And then you have no man's land, and then the enemy trench there. So that's how your trench system ultimately looked. Now, some trenches had extra communication trenches dug that led to dead ends. Now, these were called blind alleys, and they were basically done to try and confuse the enemy. So ultimately, if you got onto the other side and you found your way into a communication trench and you thought you might be onto something here, sometimes the enemy would have dug that deliberately to lead to a dead end and ultimately trap you in there as well, confuse you. So that was another way to ultimately try and deal with the enemy. Okay, so coming back to our success criteria, what we aimed to do today was firstly to understand how trench warfare developed during the First World War. So we should now be able to explain how the Germans failed in their invasion of France, and due to numerous battles that led to trench warfare where soldiers dug themselves in to protect themselves ultimately. And your second aim was to draw and label the design of the trenches on the Western Front. So you should have an image of in your jotter of what you have drawn of a trench and have some of the typical features of a trench. Okay, thank you.